Hi everyone, Christina here. Welcome to another card video at my YouTube channel and blog. Today I'm going to be using the Flower Garden stamp set from Tim Holtz and Stampers Anonymous. I've had this stamp set in my stash for quite some time, and today is the day I'm finally going to get to use it. I'm starting out by stamping one of the flower stems in Versamark ink onto some watercolor paper. This watercolor paper is Arches Cold Press, and it is cut to 7.5 by 5.5. I'm going to be creating a 5x7 card, and so I've given myself an extra ½ inch on each length or each dimension so that I can tape my watercolor piece down to a board, and then when I take off that tape I can have the colored area go all the way to the edges. I applied some Hero Arts white embossing powder over the top of that stamped image, and then I let my heat tool completely heat up before I brought it over to the watercolor paper. This ensures that I'm not applying excess heat to the area and possibly warping the watercolor paper. So this applies for all types of heat embossing, whether you're using watercolor paper or regular cardstock. It's always a great idea to let your heat tool heat up completely before bringing it to your project. I'm then stamping the flowers from the stamp set, or a few of the flowers, and after I stamp each image, I then apply some white embossing powder. I'm doing all of the images separately like this because the paper is white and my embossing is white and I'm using clear ink. So it's a little bit hard to see the placement of all the images until you have that powder on there. I wanted to have another flower stamped in between these two that I've already embossed, so I've taken some masking paper and I've created masks for all three stamps that I've already used, and then placed those over the top of my embossed images. This is going to protect the areas on those images while I stamp a third flower in between those two. I also took one of the other flowers I've already stamped and added a fourth flower down near the center bottom of the card. I then peeled off the masks and applied some white embossing powder. Now that masking paper left behind a slight residue that picked up some of that embossing powder, so I used a paintbrush to brush away the embossing powder from those areas and then heat set all of the stamped images. I'll add a few stems to those flowers that I added, and then I'll go ahead and put some embossing powder on those and then heat set that as well. This is going to finish up all of the stamping for the initial watercoloring area on the card. And I'm going to go ahead and put that down onto a hardboard and tape that down with some painter's tape. I like to use blue painter's tape because it's slightly less tacky than regular masking tape, so it protects the paper a little bit more. I had a question about removing that tape recently, and as long as you pull it back slowly and don't pull up but kind of fold it back on itself, you're usually going to prevent any tearing of paper. I'm using some different colors of Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers to do some watercoloring today. If you'd like to know what colors I use specifically, I'll have that linked down in the video description below or in the supply section at my blog. And just so you guys are aware, I always list every single product I use in my videos in the video description. So if you ever wonder about any products that I'm using, you can check that supply list there, and you'll have links to online stores as well. So after I applied a little bit of that color, I then took my water brush. This is a medium-sized water brush from Pentel, and I'm just spreading out that color. Now, I've used these Clean Color Real Brush markers in the past, and I've had really great results. Sometimes with these kind of watercolor brush markers that you might have tried, some other brands or whatever, sometimes the color really sticks to where you first apply it, and it doesn't really spread out too much. I find that these are really easy to work with. They don't tend to really seep into the paper too much. That gives you a little bit of time to spread it out. But I did want to mention that the type of paper you're using also affects how much it's going to absorb into the paper and not really spread around. This particular watercolor paper, which is Arches Cold Press, works extremely well with Clean Color Real Brush markers. The colors really spread around and you have quite a bit of time to get some of that color moving around. I have used these brush markers on some other types of watercolor paper, maybe ones that aren't quite as thick, and the color really seeps in right away and you have to really work at it to get those colors to spread. So my experience with these markers is that You really have to work in layers, and that's what gives it the most beautiful fluorescent bright glow. I noticed that these markers are so super bright, like these colors aren't even showing up true to life on camera. The pictures that you'll see at the end of the video and at my blog, those pictures are a little bit more true to life. The card is bright and vibrant. It practically glows off the page. It really reminds me of my Dr. P.H. Martin's Radiant Concentrated Watercolors, which I've used in the past. I'll link up to a video here in the top corner where I've used those and I describe a little bit how bright and vibrant they are. These markers really remind me of that medium because of the vibrancy and saturation of color. So as I add layers on top of layers of color, it really adds a depth to this whole image here. So I first started with the lightest shade and I put that over the entire area, and then I started to add some additional colors on top. I find that using pinks and purples together works really well as that light carmine and yellow. Those mix together really beautifully. You can test this out, test different color combinations out on some separate cardstock or separate watercolor paper before working on your project. Sometimes I like to do that just to make sure that I'm not going to get any strange color combinations or any muddy mixes. So I'm using the same kind of light carmine and yellow combination on that flower in the back. And then as far as the stems go, I added that same yellow color. I'm going to kind of add that in with some water. And then I'll go ahead and bring in a green color. And the green color is really going to give these stems a more realistic look. If you wanted to, you could add a little bit of blue to the stems as well. I think that would look really, really pretty, especially since the flowers are using multiple colors. It would make sense for the leaves and stems to have multiple colors as well. I chose not to add a blue in here, but you could definitely do that as well. Now I'm going to add a color that I didn't show before, and this is wine red. And I'm adding this color because I realized I wanted more contrast. I wanted more contrast on the kind of peach and yellow color flowers. And by adding in this wine red, it gives a really, really pretty depth of color. And it adds lots of contrast and gives me the opportunity to add shadows and more intricate shading on these flowers. I did end up using this color on all of the flowers, even though those pink and purple flowers have a little bit of a different color tone. I also used this color very sparingly on that first flower that I painted, the peony, because I wanted it to look different from the flower in the back. So I'm adding just little bits of shading to the different petals. I'm really thinking in my mind what would be the darkest areas on these flowers. So the center of the flower would have a little bit more darkness, and also the areas that would be directly under the folded areas of the petals. So I'm going to add the shading right underneath those folded areas, and it's really going to define the different petal shapes and make it look a little bit more realistic. So now I'm going to add that pink right underneath that folded area. And as I add it in, you'll be able to see that it makes that fold or that little cup on the end of the petal, it makes it look a little bit more forward than the rest of the flower. It really gives it a nice depth. So like I said before, I'm adding more of that wine red color to the other flowers. And I'm using it very sparingly on the pink and purple flowers just because I don't want that wine red color to overwhelm all of that beautiful vibrant pink that's showing through underneath. So I'm adding some more of that color on this petal. I'm going to let that fade out. I'm going to take my water brush and clean it off a little bit and then come back with clean water. And that's just going to help stop some of that dark red color from creeping into that entire petal shape. So I'll add some more shading into those areas. And I'll just keep painting these flowers until I'm happy with how they look. There I am adding some wine red to that bottom flower. And this is going to give it a nice depth of color. I'm going to add quite a bit of shading to the area that's right up next to the other flower so that it looks like that peony is in the front. Then added that wine red to the center of that flower, and I'm using it just a small amount because I want to make sure that it's different from that flower in the back like I mentioned previously. But I am going to add some of that red color to these outer petals just to give them some shading. So these clean color real brush markers are fantastic to work with, especially when you stamped and embossed your images like I have today. The embossing resists all of that color, and it gives you the opportunity to paint rather quickly but not have it look too messy. It's a really, really beautiful technique. I'm going to bring in gray brown. I'm going to use this on top of an acrylic block at first to put down a very light wash of color. And then I'm also going to add it directly to the paper in certain areas. So I'm using this as sort of a background color behind the flowers. I'm not being super precise about this. I just mostly want the darkest areas of the gray to be nearest the flowers. So I'm coming in and painting all these areas. Now, I did want to mention that you want to be fairly careful when you're painting up against some of these really strong colors like the reds and oranges, because if your wet paintbrush touches any of those areas, it can start to bleed out into the gray. The color does reactivate after it's been dry, so you have to be a little bit careful with that. So after I had all of that gray on there and I was happy with the results, I took my tape off my watercolor piece and then I stamped this greeting from Simon Says Stamp, and I'll have the exact stamp set listed down below. I'm using my Misty tool because I'm stamping onto watercolor paper, which is quite textured, and I wanted to make sure I got a good impression. I used VersaFine Onyx black ink for that, and then I trimmed down that watercolor piece to be slightly smaller than a 5x7 card. My card base is made out of some Basil Licorice Twist cardstock, and I folded that to create a top folding landscape 5x7 card, so I scored that at 5 inches. I then took some white cardstock that was cut to slightly smaller than 5x7, added some Tombow Extreme adhesive on the back, and then placed that on the inside of the card. This gives me a place to write a message to the card recipient. I then took my watercolor piece and put it on some foam adhesive and then press that down onto the card front. This card is almost done, but then I realized that where I placed that greeting, it looked like it was just sort of floating there. Now I was limited on where I could place that greeting because it was quite long. In fact, I did cut that stamp in half to get better placement. But in order to make it look like it belongs in that area a little bit more, I took a black marker. This happens to be a Memento Tuxedo black marker, and a T-square ruler, and I added some dashed lines going all the way across this, looking like they go behind the flowers. This really grounds that greeting and gives it more of a home on the card. So that's pretty much the card for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'm hoping to do some more of these videos using some clean color real brush markers, so watch out for those in the future. Thanks so much for watching today's video. Like I said before, all of the supplies are listed down below or over at my blog. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next card video.